This is episode 6 of Everything History, and let me say welcome back. Before we get going, I'd like to remind you all to go to the iTunes store, find this podcast, that's Everything History with Thomas Hendrickson, and rate, review, and subscribe.
I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Everything History just wrapped up the causes of the French Revolution in the last episode, and that gives us a great starting point to begin the full-course history meal that is the French Revolution of 1789. If you didn't catch the previous episode, that is quite alright, but I must implore you to go back when you finish this episode, otherwise you might be wondering why all this stuff is even happening. As a quick recap though, basically France is in a state of crisis by the mid to late 1780s because of a variety of causes. The most well known is their massive financial problems, but other issues include a confusing, broken political system and an outdated feudalistic social structure. When we last left France, it was in the late 1780s and it was suffering from social, cultural, political, and financial problems. The French monarchy was no longer secure under Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. The French people were starving and the whole society was teetering on the edge. By 1787, the animosity between the three estates had grown to a fever pitch. The Third Estate was plainly proclaiming that if changes weren't made in the nation, that violence would follow. Fears were growing because famine was beginning to spread, and if bread continued to be short, then anarchy would soon follow. We jump into the story in early 1787. The king and his ministers were fully aware of the horrifying state of the French kingdom. King Louis XVI and his ministers greatly desired to relieve the burden from the Third Estate. The Third Estate represented 97% of the 28 million French people, and 80 to 90% of them, by 1787, were struggling to bring home a single loaf of bread a day for their entire family. The reforms proposed by the king were written by his comptroller general, Charles Alexander de Calonne. A comptroller is basically a financial minister, by the way. The proposals sought to radically change the tax code and provide a system of monetary exchange in order to provide bread to those who needed it. The radical changes would have forced the First and Second Estates of France to pay for more taxes than usual, but in the past they had rarely paid any taxes at all. As you can imagine, the social structure of France was broken and causing the kingdom to buckle and fracture under the weight of the country's financial obligations. Much of what I am running through right now was mentioned previously, so this is sort of an accidental review. But moving on, Charles Calonne and King Louis XVI wanted their reforms to be approved by the Parliament of Paris in order to be more easily accepted. They could pass the laws through royal edict, but they did not want to upset the populace any more than they already were. The problem was the judges that made up the Parliament were members of the First and Second Estates, and they did not want to be taxed, and saw the king's proposals as an act of political blackmail by the Third Estate. This conflict of interest caused by the single-minded, introspective elite of France was instrumental in the destruction of their society. Calonne saw the defiance of the Parliament and tried to circumvent their oncoming veto by summoning the Assembly of Notables in early 1787. The Assembly of Notables was an advisory body of nobles that had not been convened since the 17th century. Calonne's plan was to explain the matter to the nobles of the Assembly and have them approve it, and thereby pressure the Parliament into approving the tax reform laws. The thing was, the Assembly was fully aware of what Calonne and the king were proposing, and they were strongly against it. That seems selfish in retrospect, but it's exactly what you would expect the French aristocracy to do. Why would anyone want to vote away power? It's simply against human nature, and to expect the French nobles to be unbiased is foolish. Calonne was no fool, though. He knew he was walking into the wolves' den by bringing the matter to the Assembly of Notables. That being the case, Calonne came out firing. He openly accused the aristocracy of abusing the French tax system. He declared the only justification for such abuses were, quote, self-interest, influence, wealth, and ancient prejudices. The comptroller then took a step back and pleaded to their humanity, saying, "What are all these together compared with the common good and necessity of the state? These abuses oppress the wealth-producing laboring class. The abuses, exceptions, and exemptions of privilege relieve one section of taxpayers by aggravating the conditions of the others." He then laid out His Majesty's plan to broaden the tax base to include the clergy and nobles. to restructure the grain market, and to eliminate the tax exemption abuses. I doubt even the greatest orators could have put it better than Calonne actually did, but it was to no avail. The notables of the assembly seemed oblivious in the face of disaster. The situation was bleak for the king, but the fight was not entirely over when it came to reforms. Many of the nobles at the assembly were quite simply confused and uninformed about what was happening. The historian William Doyle spoke on this, saying, "Most of the nobles felt uncertain about who they spoke for." Marquis de Lafayette, who was involved in our American Revolution series, also said, quote, "We were not the representatives of the nation, but we declared that although we had no right to impede, it was our right not to advise unless we knew the returns of expenditure and the plans of the economy." What Lafayette just told us is of the utmost importance. It spoke directly to the tension between the crown, the ministers, the notables, and the Third Estate. The statement from Lafayette was in a letter sent to George Washington, and from the beginning Lafayette conveys a concern. He says, quote, "We were not the representatives of the nation." Lafayette is plainly telling his friend Washington, and us, that the Assembly of Notables did not represent France, implying that its authority seemed hollow to Lafayette. He then proceeded to note that, quote, "We had no right to impede." What he means by that is that by the letter of the law, the monarch, King Louis in this case, had complete authority, and the Assembly of Notables was simply an advisory body. That being the case, Lafayette also tells us that the Assembly did not want to advise the Comptroller General or the King until, quote, "we knew the returns of expenditure and the plans for the economy." That was the really juicy bit right there, because it meant that the state of the actual economy was unknown outside of the king and his ministers. In other words, people did not trust the accountability of the comptroller or the king, and it was this kind of distrust that caused screaming matches between the royal officials and the notables. So, the reason I love that quote by Lafayette is because it takes us not only into the scene at the Assembly of Notables in the spring of 1787, but it also explains what was wrong with France at that exact time. Let me list it out. Problem number 1. As Lafayette told us, the people were not represented. Number 2, the king's authority was being impeded on by the so-called advisory assemblies and parliaments. And number 3, the people did not trust the monarch and his administrators, which is why they were demanding to see the economic paperwork before going on. Eventually, Charles Calonne revealed to the notables the financial statements of the kingdom. The assembly was shocked to learn of how terrible the situation was, and they also quickly realized that clearly misinformation about the economy had been dealt in the last years. Instead of meeting Calonne halfway or trying to come up with a viable solution to the problem, the majority of the assembly demanded an explanation from the comptroller. Calonne, who had only had the job for a few months, explained truthfully that for decades the kingdom had been failing to keep up with debt payments, and that was why the debt was so extravagant. He also revealed that they had evidently been misled about the financial situation because the previous comptroller, Jacques Necker, had falsified reports and intentionally committed national fraud. This was a fatal mistake by Calonne because he told the truth, and the notables were appalled by this information, but more were in disbelief. In fact, most were in angry disbelief. Many of the notables had a profound, although misplaced, respect for Jacques Necker, and the author William Doyle explained that, quote, "the Neckerites were outraged, while those who did not know who to believe demanded to see even more detailed accounts in order to make up their minds." At this point in the Assembly's discussion, everything went off the rails entirely. The Assembly of Notables stopped looking for solutions and wanted someone to blame. The meetings were supposed to be kept private, but within days, smear campaigns were being published throughout pamphlets and journals across Paris. The victim of this ridiculous onslaught, and it truly was ridiculous, was Charles Calonne. Despite having done nothing truly wrong, Calonne rapidly became the public enemy. Thus, Comptroller General Calonne was made a scapegoat and fell from politics so hard that he was actually exiled from Paris. The public even celebrated his firing, declaring Calonne Monsieur Deficit, which I'm guessing means Mr. Deficit, which is not a very flattering title. The assembly continued on, though, and the king replaced Calonne with a noble of no significance to our history. Unsurprisingly, the talks disintegrated in a matter of days in mid-April. Many of the notables no longer wanted to be involved in the problems of the state, and many more simply wanted to be rid of the problem. On May 21st, when in conversation with the king's brother, Count d'Artois, Lafayette said, quote, It seems to me that this is the moment for us to beseech His Majesty to fix, immediately in order to render account to him of all measures and settle their happy outcome forever, the convocation of a truly National Assembly. Count d'Artois sat straight and asked the Marquis, "What, sir? Are you calling for the Estates General?" Lafayette replied in the affirmative. Now, what is the Estates General, you ask? Great question. The Estates General was a legislative advisory body of great significance during France's old regime. It was made up of representatives from all three estates that were elected to their station. The Estates General had no power in itself, but was convened only in extreme emergencies. I stress extreme emergencies. And it had not been in session since 1614. And King Louis XVI had no desire to convene the estates because it would have showed how low the kingdom of France had been brought. The king was wise to fear reconvening the body, because calling for such a measure could open up the possibility of rebellion. The king closed the Assembly of Notables on May 25th, and though the rumors of an Estates General began to fly, the king wanted to avoid such a matter at all costs. He had not yet given up on his reforms, so he sought the counsel of his ministers. His Justice Minister, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but I'm just going to go through it anyways, Chrétien François de Livignon, advised his king by saying, "The sovereign power belongs to the king alone. The rights of its ruler remain unchanged. Legislative power resides in the person of the sovereign, and sharing with no one." In other words, his Minister of Justice was reminding him that he did not need the Assembly, the Parliaments, or the Estates General to invoke reforms. King Louis, though, was hesitant to display such sovereign authority. He feared a backlash from the people and greatly feared rebellion, or worse, revolution. Let me say that such fears are justified, but King Louis's reservations and idleness in the face of societal collapse did nothing to help prevent revolution. In fact, they helped it along, which is why many historians point to King Louis's poor leadership, or lack of leadership, as a cause of France's collapse. So as the summer of 1787 began, King Louis decided against the advice of his Justice Minister and took the reforms back to the Parliament for approval. The Parliament's view had changed slightly, but they were still in full opposition to any of the king's reforms. The change in their views was that the nobles of the Parliament now wanted the king to convene the Estates General. That's not to say, though, that everyone was in favor of calling the Estates General. In fact, many feared what would happen if the king convened the body. Etienne Pascard, a young lawyer in the Parliament during this time, wrote of this very topic in his memoirs. He recalled, quote, "While many were in favor of the Estates General, the sober hands were troubled at the prospect. I could never forget what one old judge said to me. 'Young man, a similar idea was brought forth in your grandfather's time.' I inquired further, and this is what he said then. 'Messieurs, this is not a game for children. The first time France sees the Estates General again, she will also see a terrible revolution.'" Those are powerful, sobering words that we should keep in mind throughout this tale. There's a third party involved in these politics that I must remind you of as well. The obvious parties were the members of the Parliament and the king. But the third party was the public, and they played a great influential role. So what was the public's opinion? Well, you will recall that this is the same French public that condemned the innocent Calonne as Monsieur Deficit simply because the notables had accused him of treachery. That same line of thinking had yet to change, and a vast majority of the population was firmly against the king's reforms, despite the fact that they didn't really know what they were. William Doyle adds, "The Parliament knew that the public expected a resolute show of opposition, and great crowds assembled whenever the Parliament met, and all over the capital political clubs and discussion groups were mushrooming, reading and sponsoring the ever-swelling flow of pamphlets and broadsheets." And Doyle also adds that by August there was, quote, "a rebellious atmosphere in the capital." And on August 6th, the Parliament refused to sponsor the reforms as the palace was surrounded by, quote, "the biggest crowd anyone could remember." As the debates closed, the nobles of the Parliament advised the calling of the Estates General again, declaring that only the Estates General had the authority to authorize such reforms. As an aside, that last bit was completely false. Only the sovereign had that authority, remember. The Parliament desired to continue, but the king was now fed up. He dissolved the session on August 15th and came to the slow realization that his reforms were not going to gain any approval, at least for the moment. The topic of taxation and reforms dwindled out in the last months of 1787. The king now had another problem. He had lost control of the public opinion, and his administration set about rectifying that problem. The main problem was the rampant incorrect news spread by thousands of journals and pamphlets across France. Royal troops and police forces set about putting an end to this craze of misinformation by force. Publishing houses were shut down or put under watch, and crowds were forcibly made to disperse in order to prevent riots. It actually worked too, because by early September everything seemed back to normal. Calm even. As you might imagine, that did not last for long. The reason it didn't last is because the king had finally decided to put his foot down about some of his proposals. He issued an edict forcing the registration of several taxes throughout his kingdom. These tax edicts meant that the king was declaring by his authority that the taxes would be in effect and registered on the tax code. This act of political force invited much trouble and resistance. Royal guards were harassed throughout Paris, common peasants defied police orders, and rumors of a march on Versailles began to spread. These edicts may have been too little too late by King Louis. Such sweeping authority may have worked in January or February of 87, as I have mentioned in the previous episode prior, but after the disastrous politics of the Assembly of Notables and the Parliament, the public opinion was strongly and violently opposed to such a power move. Let's take a step back from the story here and describe exactly what Louis XVI had been through from February to October of 1787. In February, he was much loved and appreciated by clergy, nobles, and commoners alike. They had their differences, but overall, it was a very strong relationship. In March, everything slipped out of his control due to bad political maneuvering, and he was forced to fire Calonne, his own financial minister. The king then allowed himself to be dragged through the political wringer until August, and by that time he had lost the support of the nobles and the peasants. Louis was not hated, but his leadership hadn't exactly been invoking confidence. Okay, stepping back into the story now. The tax edicts were not going over well at all, and protests, boycotts, and riots were popping up throughout the nation. The local county parliaments of France were also organizing resistance as well, refusing to register the taxes in their own districts despite the royal edict. Thus tensions were once again running high, and King Louis and his cabinet changed their methodology again. You have to give them that. They really were trying to solve the crisis, but the crisis simply wouldn't subside. Louis XVI was frustrated, and rightly so. He tried to help alleviate the fiscal crisis, and it incited a political crisis. When he attempted to tame the political controversy, a social crisis exploded. Everything appeared to be almost unsolvable. Nevertheless, the king persisted, this time attempting to alleviate all three crises at once. Top priority on the royal agenda was keeping the government afloat. They needed some sort of money so they wouldn't default on their massive debts. This would require a massive chunk of change, and they needed to acquire it before 1788. The only real option the king had was a series of loans. The catch, though, was that these loans carried a higher interest rate, and in order to not increase the deficit further, more revenue was required to pay off the loan interest every year. The only and obvious solution to this was another tax, a regrettable but necessary measure. This tax was a land tax only to last for 5 years, but there was no way this tax could gain approval, and it would only serve to exacerbate the country's troubling issues during a time of extended crisis. But there was a way this could work without angering everybody. It could work if the Parliament of Paris approved of it, because then the people of the Third Estate would likely approve of it as well. That was all well and good in theory, but how in the blazes could the king convince the Parliament to vote in assent? Well, he needed to extend a few olive branches, and he did just that by first suspending the tax edicts until Parliament gave approval. Second, he agreed to reconvene the Assembly of Notables alongside Parliament. And thirdly, he agreed to convene the Estates General by 1792 if substantial improvement to the kingdom was not made. The nobles celebrated the concessions and hailed the wisdom of their king, agreeing to come into session in November. The public had mixed emotions about this, but calm prevailed for the next 2 months until November 19th, when the talks continued again between the Parliament, the Assembly, and the king. The talks began very well with the discussion of the required loans and the land tax to pay their interest. After some 8 to 9 hours of talking, the majority of the body were in favor of registering the loans. The only talk that truly annoyed the king was the never-ending call for the Estates General that every man present seemed intent on ending his opinion with. Just before the vote was to be carried out, though, a pompous and overwrought man, a one Duke Orleans, rose out of turn, saying, "Sire, I beg your majesty to allow me to place in the heart of this court the view that I consider this registration illegal." Now how would you, as the sovereign, respond to such a remark? It was annoying, sure, but what the king probably should have said is something along the lines of, "Yes, Monsieur Orleans, your opinion has been heard and noted. Now let the vote begin." You could even say that in a mean or sarcastic manner. But did King Louis do that? Of course not. He was caught so off guard that he stammered out, I don't care. It's legal because I wish it." Literally the worst thing he could have said. And he said it while stuttering. Historians universally agreed that his reply was fatal to the king's plans. How so, you ask? Well, Simon Schama described it as so. The king's response unerringly struck the worst possible note, petulance followed by facetiousness. The effect of this peculiar performance could not have been more damaging. Despotism that failed to have the courage of its convictions. And William Doyle described it by saying, "No reply could have been more catastrophic. Therefore the king's words turned what seemed to be a governmental triumph into a disaster." I really enjoy those quotes. The last line by Schama is especially pertinent. The line referred to the royal government and said, quote, "Despotism that failed to have the courage of its convictions." If I was asked why the old regime had failed, especially under Louis XVI, I would point to that exact quote. Because the king had the power of a despot, but simply lacked the conviction to carry out his own will. He even stammered when saying, it's legal because I wish it." King Louis XVI was no doubt a gifted man in many respects, but by God, he was not a leader. Anyways, indeed, the loans were actually passed and registered, but all of the king's other plans to lessen the crisis went up in smoke that night. Nearly instantaneously, the nobles and the people were unified against the king and his plans again. The hope of any further reforms was now politically impossible thanks to another misstep by King Louis. As 1788 began, the calls for the Estates General continued as even the public began to get behind the idea. King Louis continued to ignore the pleas, but the local parliaments of France were not waiting. Throughout early 1788, they sent petition after petition to the king saying quite a lot of falsehoods. For example, on April 11th, they wrote the king saying he did not have the authority to make the laws alone. And on May 3rd, they insisted that the Estates General was required before more taxation could even be considered. Both statements were blatantly false, but it didn't seem to matter. The king refused to acknowledge their pleas. Many popular printers began publishing anti-government writings in Paris as the summer neared as well. All in all, 1788 would lack improvement in every way. Bad weather and blighted soil decreased the already low food supply again, nobody in government could get along, and the tension of the French crisis did not abate, but rather it intensified every day, until finally the tension reached a breaking point at a city called Grenoble, where French blood would finally be spilled. That will have to wait until next episode, though. When Everything History resumes next episode, we will explore the summer conflicts, including the so-called Day of Tiles in Grenoble in June of 1788. Be prepared, too, for King Louis will finally be forced to convene the Estates General. Is that good or bad? Come back next episode to find out. And if you liked what you heard, go ahead and subscribe on iTunes and be sure to give an iTunes review as well.
Thank you, and good night.